The emergency alarm screamed through the halls of the Coalition Command Center. Admiral Kess pressed her three-fingered hand against the cold metal wall and felt the vibrations of distant explosions. The Void Swarm had broken through the outer defense grid again. This time they had consumed 17 worlds in just 2 days. "How many ships did we lose?" Kess asked without turning around. She already knew the answer would be bad. 237 vessels destroyed, Admiral," reported her aide, a young Altari with purple-spotted skin. "The Void Swarm adapted to our plasma weapons in less than an hour. They're learning faster than we can develop new tactics." Cassie closed her large black eyes and tried to push away the despair. In her 140 years of military service, she had never faced an enemy like this. The Void Swarm moved through space like a disease, consuming everything in their path. Their crystalline ships could absorb energy weapons and turn them into fuel. Their warriors adapted to any attack within minutes. Conventional warfare was useless against them. "What about the hegemony's new battlecruisers?" Kess asked, though she suspected the answer. "Destroyed at Kepler Station. The Swarm figured out how to turn their shield generators into bombs." The aide's voice cracked slightly. "Admiral, we're running out of options. The Council is talking about evacuation protocols for the core worlds." Evacuation. The word tasted bitter in Kess's mind. 23 different species had joined the Coalition over the past 1,000 years. They had built the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known. Now they were preparing to abandon it all and run deeper into space, hoping the Void Swarm would eventually stop chasing them. "There has to be something we haven't tried," Kess muttered. She walked to the massive window overlooking the military staging area. Thousands of ships floated in perfect formation, their crews preparing for what might be the final battle. "What about the Mercenary Guild? The warrior clans?" "Already deployed, Admiral. The mercenaries lasted 3 hours at the Vega colony. The warrior clans held out for almost a day at New Sparta, but the aide didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what happened when the Swarm overwhelmed a position." Kess turned away from the window. Somewhere in this galaxy, there had to be warriors who could face the Swarm and win. The Coalition had explored less than half of the known galaxy. There were thousands of worlds they had never visited, species they had never contacted. "Bring me the Deep Space Survey reports," she ordered. "All of them, even the incomplete ones." Her aide looked confused but began pulling up files on the main display screen. Hundreds of star systems appeared, most marked with yellow symbols indicating preliminary scans only. A few showed red warnings for dangerous conditions or hostile environments. Kess studied the display carefully. The Coalition preferred to contact species from stable worlds with mild climates and friendly environments. They avoided systems with extreme conditions or dangerous wildlife. But maybe that was exactly wrong. Maybe they needed to find warriors who had grown up fighting for their lives. "Filter the results," Kess said. "Show me only the worlds marked as hazardous or dangerous." The display changed, showing far fewer systems. Most were marked with warnings about radiation, toxic atmospheres, or extreme weather. A few had notes about aggressive wildlife or geological instability. One system caught her attention immediately. "Sol system," she read aloud. "Single star, third planet shows signs of life, but..." Her voice trailed off as she read the full report. "This can't be right. The survey report described a world so dangerous it shouldn't have any life at all. The planet's surface was covered with massive storms, active volcanoes, and temperature variations that could kill most known species. The oceans were filled with predators larger than Coalition battleships. The land masses crawled with creatures that the survey team described as nature's perfect killing machines. But the most shocking part of the report was buried in the final paragraph. Despite all these hazards, the planet was home to an intelligent species that had not only survived but somehow thrived. They had built cities, developed technology, and even begun exploring their local space. "Admiral," her aide said nervously, "surely you're not considering contact with a species from such a dangerous world." The survey team classified it as a Category 12 death world. No civilization has ever survived on anything above Category 7. Kess smiled for the first time in weeks. "Exactly. If they survived on a world like that, imagine what they could do against the Void Swarm. She turned to her communication officer. Open a channel to the diplomatic corps. I need their best first contact specialist. Within hours, Vel arrived at the command center. The diplomatic specialist was a tall, thin creature from the peaceful Centauri worlds, known for their ability to communicate with almost any species. Vel had successfully negotiated treaties with over 50 different civilizations during their career. Admiral, I've reviewed the survey data on this Sol system, Vel said, their translator making their musical language sound almost normal. I must advise caution. A species that evolved under such extreme conditions might be unpredictable. Unpredictable is exactly what we need, Kess replied. The Void Swarm adapts to predictable tactics. Maybe we need allies who don't think like civilized beings. Vel looked uncomfortable but nodded. Very well, I'll prepare a standard first contact package. Cultural gifts, translation matrices, basic technology demonstrations. No, Kess said firmly. No gifts, no demonstrations. Just tell them the truth. Tell them we're losing a war and we need warriors. If they're truly survivors from a death world, they'll understand. The diplomatic mission launched 3 days later. Vel's ship was small and fast, designed for stealth rather than combat. As they approached the Sol system, long-range sensors confirmed the survey data. The third planet was indeed a nightmare, world of constant danger. But as they drew closer, they detected something that made Vel's 4 hearts skip in unison. The space around the planet was filled with primitive but functional spacecraft. The beings from this death world weren't just survivors. They were explorers pushing out into the darkness despite having no idea what they might find there. When the first radio transmissions reached the diplomatic ship, Vel knew immediately that these creatures were unlike anything the Coalition had ever encountered. Their languages were harsh and direct. Their communications were filled with references to conflict, competition, and something they called adventure. Most disturbing of all, they seemed genuinely excited by the prospect of danger. The formal first contact took place in orbit around their moon, a lifeless rock that the beings had somehow turned into a staging area for further exploration. When Vel explained the Coalition's desperate situation and asked for military assistance. The response was immediate and shocking. Every major political group on the planet volunteered their finest warriors within hours. They didn't ask about payment or territorial compensation. They wanted to know only 2 things: how dangerous was the enemy, and how soon could they start fighting. When Vel nervously suggested that perhaps a few thousand volunteers would be sufficient for initial deployment, the humans, as they called themselves, responded by mobilizing 2 million warriors in less than 3 days. As Vel's ship raced back toward Coalition space with confirmation of humanity's offer, the diplomatic specialist couldn't shake the feeling that they might have just made the galaxy's most dangerous mistake. The Coalition had asked for soldiers to fight an impossible war. What they were getting instead were Deathworld Psychopaths who seemed to think impossible wars sounded like fun. The transport ships arrived at Nexus 7 like a storm approaching a peaceful shore. Commander Iril watched through the observation deck as 20 massive human vessels descended toward the military staging planet. Each ship was covered in crude modifications that made Coalition engineers cringe. Weapon systems had been mounted in impossible configurations. Armor plating was welded over areas that should have remained accessible for maintenance. Worst of all, the humans had painted symbols and messages on their hull exteriors using colors that were visible from space. They have no sense of proper military protocol, muttered Lieutenant Sec, Iril's aide. The young officer's green skin had turned pale blue with anxiety. Look at those ships. They've turned military vessels into individual expressions of chaos. Iril nodded grimly. In all his years of military service, he had never seen anything like this. Coalition forces maintained strict standards for equipment appearance and functionality. These human ships looked like they had been assembled by enthusiastic amateurs rather than professional military engineers. The first human to step off the transport was a broad-shouldered male with scars covering his visible skin. He wore Coalition-issued clothing that had been modified in several ways that probably violated regulations. His hair was cut shorter than most species could survive, and his eyes moved constantly, as if searching for threats that didn't exist. "Commander, Earl?" The human's voice was rough and direct. "I'm Captain Rex, thanks for the invitation to this party." Earl blinked in confusion. "Party? Captain, this is a military staging facility for preparation against an existential threat to galactic civilization." Rex grinned, showing teeth that looked designed for tearing meat. "Yeah, that's what I said. A party." He gestured toward the ships behind him. "We brought 2,000 of our best fighters for this first batch. When do we start breaking things?" The integration problems began immediately. Coalition military doctrine required soldiers to maintain equipment according to precise specifications. The humans took their issued gear and immediately began modifying it. Standard battle armor was stripped down, rebuilt, and somehow made more effective despite violating every engineering principle in the Coalition manual. "Sir," reported Sergeant Wen, the facility's quartermaster, "the humans have requested additional supplies. They want more ammunition, larger weapons, and something they call backup explosives for when their primary explosives run out." Earl felt a headache developing between his sensory organs. What do they need backup explosives for? The primary ammunition load should be sufficient for any reasonable engagement. They claim that reasonable engagements are boring, sir. The cultural problems were even worse than the equipment issues. Coalition species required regulated rest periods, carefully balanced nutrition, and environmental controls to maintain peak performance. The humans seemed to actively seek out discomfort. They exercised by lifting heavy objects repeatedly for no apparent purpose. They consumed liquids that registered as mildly toxic on Coalition scanners. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to function better under stress rather than worse. Dr. Tal, the facility's medical officer, submitted his first report on human physiology with obvious distress. "Commander, I don't understand how these beings are still alive. Their cardiovascular system operates at pressure levels that would cause immediate organ failure in any civilized species. They have redundant systems for nearly every vital function. Most concerning, they appear to have evolved pain responses that encourage continued activity, rather than rest and recovery." The breaking point came during the first joint training exercise. Coalition doctrine emphasized careful planning, coordinated tactics, and overwhelming technological superiority. The training scenario was designed to teach proper formation fighting against simulated void swarm units. Rex gathered his human troops in what appeared to be a completely disorganized group. There were no formation markers, no communication protocols, and no apparent chain of command beyond Rex himself. When the exercise began, Coalition forces moved forward in perfect geometric patterns, while maintaining optimal firing positions and communication links. The humans charged directly at the enemy simulation with no apparent plan beyond kill everything that moves. "Captain Rex," Earl called over the communication system, "your forces are completely out of position. You've abandoned all defensive formations and left your flanks exposed to enemy counterattack." "Yeah," Rex replied cheerfully while his troops engaged simulated void swarm warriors in close combat using improvised weapons. "But we're winning." He was right. Somehow, despite ignoring every principle of civilized warfare, the human forces were systematically destroying the enemy simulation. They adapted to changing conditions without waiting for orders. They used their own bodies as shields to protect equipment rather than the reverse. Most impossibly, they turned desperate situations into advantages through sheer refusal to acknowledge when they were supposed to lose. The exercise ended with complete human victory and 0 Coalition casualties. The humans had absorbed massive damage but continued fighting as if injuries were minor inconveniences. Their casualty reports listed soldiers as walking wounded, who should have been in intensive medical care. "How?" Earl asked Rex during the post-exercise debrief. "How did your forces achieve victory using tactics that should have resulted in complete annihilation?" Rex shrugged. "We've been fighting for survival our whole lives. Your training scenario assumed we would be afraid of getting hurt or killed. But we grew up on a world where everything is trying to hurt or kill us anyway. This was actually pretty safe compared to a normal Tuesday back home." Errol studied the human captain with growing unease. Captain, what exactly is a normal Tuesday on your world like? Well, you wake up and check if any of the weather is trying to kill you today. Then you have breakfast while avoiding the smaller predators. After that, you go to work, which usually involves either fighting something bigger than you or building something that might explode if you make a mistake. In the evening, you relax by doing dangerous things for entertainment. Rex paused. Why do you ask? That night, Errol filed his report with Coalition Command with a heavy heart. The humans were undoubtedly effective warriors, but they operated according to principles that no civilized species could understand. They treated potentially fatal injuries as temporary setbacks. They considered overwhelming odds to be interesting rather than terrifying. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to genuinely enjoy combat in ways that suggested fundamental psychological differences from normal sentient beings. His recommendation was simple. The humans were too dangerous to integrate with regular coalition forces. They should be deployed as an independent unit with minimal oversight and maximum distance from civilized troops. The response from Admiral Kess was even simpler. Recommendation denied. The Void Swarm destroyed another 12 worlds yesterday. Deploy the humans immediately and prepare facilities for the next wave of volunteers. As Errol watched the human forces preparing for their first real combat deployment, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Coalition had made a terrible mistake. They had asked for soldiers to fight an impossible war against an unbeatable enemy. What they had received instead were barely contained weapons of mass destruction who thought impossible. Wars were the most fun they'd had in years. The galaxy would never be the same. The mining colony of Taris Prime had been silent for 6 hours when the distress signal finally reached Coalition Command. By the time the emergency response fleet assembled, long-range sensors showed the unmistakable signature of Void Swarm, bioships converging on the system. 60 crystalline vessels moved through space like living nightmares, their surfaces pulsing with captured energy from destroyed Coalition defenses. Colonel Mack stood in the briefing room aboard the human flagship, Defiance studying the tactical display with obvious satisfaction. Around him, his officers examined the same data with expressions that made Coalition observers deeply uncomfortable. Where civilized species would see overwhelming odds and probable defeat, the humans seemed to see an interesting challenge. 60 ships, Max said thoughtfully. That's more than we've faced before, but not ridiculously more. He pointed to the display showing Void Swarm formation patterns. They're moving in standard dispersal configuration, probably expecting us to engage at long range with the usual Coalition tactics. Lieutenant Ford, a human with cybernetic implants, covering half her skull, grinned fiercely. So we do something they won't expect? Always, Mac replied. The alien observers aren't going to like this, but that's their problem. He turned to address the room. Standard human doctrine applies. We let them get close, we board their ships, and we remind them why evolution made us the apex predators on our world. Commander Errol, who had been assigned to observe human tactics, felt his 3 hearts sink into his lower torso. Colonel Mack, surely you don't intend to allow enemy vessels to board your ships? That goes against every principle of space combat doctrine. Mack looked at Errol with something that might have been pity. Commander, your doctrine assumes that being boarded is a bad thing. But if the enemy comes to you, you don't have to chase them around the system. He turned back to his officers. How long until contact? 2 hours, sir, reported the navigation officer. The Void Swarm is maintaining approach speed and hasn't deviated from projected course. Perfect. That gives us time to prepare the welcome party. The preparation involved activities that no Coalition military manual had ever contemplated. Human engineers began removing safety barriers from critical systems. Weapons officers prepared close-range armaments that were designed for ship-to-ship boarding actions rather than space combat. Most disturbing of all, medical teams began setting up treatment stations for injuries that assumed surviving crew members would continue fighting, despite wounds that should have been immediately fatal. When the Void Swarm fleet entered weapons range, the Coalition ships opened fire according to standard doctrine. Energy weapons lashed out across the darkness, impacting crystalline hulls that absorbed the energy and converted it to fuel for swarm systems. The alien ships continued their approach without apparent damage. The human ships waited until the void swarm was close enough to begin boarding actions. Then they did something that defied every principle of civilized warfare. They deliberately shut down their defensive systems and opened their airlocks. "Colonel," Iril called desperately over the communication system, "your ships are being boarded. Your defensive perimeter has been completely compromised." "That's the idea," Mac replied calmly. "Hard to fight an enemy that adapts to long-range weapons. Much easier to fight them face-to-face with improvised clubs." Through the observation windows, Iril watched in horror as void swarm boarding pods penetrated human ship hulls. The crystalline warriors inside were designed for ship-to-ship combat in zero-gravity environments. Their energy weapons could cut through bulkheads like paper. Their adaptive armor could deflect any known projectile weapon. What they couldn't adapt to was a human with a crowbar who had grown up fighting things twice his size for the privilege of eating dinner. The sounds coming over the communication system defied description. Void swarm warriors communicated through harmonic frequencies that translated as precise tactical information. Human warriors communicated through shouted encouragement that mostly consisted of profanity and challenges to fight harder. The two approaches to combat were so fundamentally different that the void swarm's adaptive systems simply couldn't process what was happening. "Mac to all ships," the colonel's voice crackled over the speakers. "Remember, these crystal bugs are tough, but they're not used to close-quarters fighting. Use their own broken pieces against them. If your weapon breaks, find a bigger piece of ship to hit them with." The battle raged for 3 hours. Coalition long-range sensors showed massive energy spikes from human vessels as void swarm weapons discharged inside their hulls. By all reasonable expectations, the human ships should have been completely destroyed within minutes. Instead, the energy signatures began decreasing as human crew members systematically overpowered void swarm boarding parties using tactics that violated several interstellar conventions regarding proper treatment of prisoners. The humans didn't take prisoners. They collected trophies. When the last void swarm bioship finally retreated from the system, the human fleet limped back toward Taris Prime. Their ships were barely functional. Hull breaches had been sealed with emergency patches that wouldn't pass safety inspection on a civilian cargo hauler. Critical systems were held together with improvised repairs that seemed to work through sheer stubborn refusal to fail. The casualty reports made Coalition medical staff physically ill. 70% of human personnel were wounded. 12% were dead. The survivors were celebrating. "Colonel Mac," Iril called over the communication system, "your forces have suffered catastrophic casualties. Your ships require immediate evacuation to medical facilities." "Negative," Mac replied cheerfully. "We're operational and ready for the next engagement. This was good practice for the real fight." Iril stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The humans had won the Coalition's first major victory against the Void Swarm, but the cost had been horrific. Any civilized species would be mourning their losses and requesting reinforcements. The humans were asking when they could do it again. Dr. Tal's medical report summed up the situation with clinical precision. The human approach to warfare appears to be fundamentally different from all known military doctrine. They consider acceptable casualty rates that would represent total defeat for any other species. They treat life-threatening injuries as temporary inconveniences. Most concerning, they seem to derive psychological satisfaction from combat scenarios that would traumatize normal sentient beings. The report concluded with a recommendation that human forces be deployed only against enemies too dangerous for conventional coalition troops to engage. Admiral Kess approved the recommendation immediately. The Void Swarm had just learned that the galaxy contained a species willing to fight them on their own terms. The crystalline enemy had adapted to every known form of warfare. They had never encountered beings who considered warfare to be recreational activity. As news of the Taris Prime victory spread throughout Coalition space, military analysts struggled to understand how the humans had succeeded where conventional forces had failed. The answer was simultaneously simple and terrifying. The humans hadn't tried to fight the Void Swarm according to civilized rules. They had fought them according to the rules of a death world where only the most dangerous survived. And in that contest, Humanity had proven they were still the most dangerous thing in their neighborhood. The reports coming from the front lines made no sense to Coalition strategists. Human forces were volunteering for assignments that other species classified as impossible suicide missions. They established bases in radiation zones that should have killed them within hours. They operated equipment in gravity wells that should have crushed their fragile organic bodies. Most impossibly, they maintained morale in conditions that drove other species to complete psychological breakdown. General Holt reviewed the latest deployment requests from his command center aboard the converted mining station that humans had, renamed Last Stand. The facility orbited a dying star that emitted radiation levels lethal to most known life forms. Coalition engineers had declared the location uninhabitable. Human engineers had turned it into their primary staging area for deep space operations. "Sir," reported Major Stone, her face bearing new scars from the recent engagement at Kepler Station. "We have deployment requests from all human units. 43 volunteer groups want assignment to the Nightmare Sector. 67 units have requested permission to establish forward bases in the void zones. And somehow 12 separate teams want to attempt infiltration of active void swarm hive clusters." Holt nodded approvingly. The Nightmare Sector was a region of space where gravitational anomalies made navigation nearly impossible, and energy weapons functioned unpredictably. The void zones were areas where previous swarm attacks had left reality itself damaged, creating pockets where physical laws operated differently. As for infiltrating active hive clusters, Coalition military doctrine classified such missions as theoretical exercises in creative suicide. "Approved," Holt said simply. "If they think they can handle it, let them try. What's the status on our conventional support from Coalition forces?" Stone's expression darkened slightly. "Mixed, sir. Coalition Command appreciates our effectiveness against the Void Swarm, but they're concerned about our operational methods. Admiral Kess has filed several reports requesting that we coordinate more closely with regular Coalition forces. And every time we coordinate with regular Coalition forces, they request immediate evacuation from the combat zone." Stone paused. "Apparently watching us fight gives their crews psychological trauma." Holt sighed. The integration problems were getting worse rather than better. Coalition species had evolved on peaceful worlds where conflicts were resolved through negotiation and careful planning. They couldn't understand humans who approached warfare as a problem-solving exercise that happened to involve high casualty rates. The communication system chimed with an incoming priority message from the front lines. Lieutenant Rivers appeared on the display screen, his uniform torn and his face covered with some kind of crystalline dust that probably wasn't safe to breathe. "General Holt, sir, reporting from the Haven's End operation." "What's your status, Lieutenant?" Rivers grinned through the crystal dust. "Sir, the Void Swarm has deployed some kind of new weapon. It's creating localized distortion zones where physics gets creative. Gravity changes direction randomly, energy weapons stop working properly, and time flows at different speeds in different areas." Holt felt a familiar excitement building in his chest. "Casualties?" "Minimal, sir. The Coalition forces evacuated as soon as the distortions began. They said the area was incompatible with organized military operations. And our forces? We moved in immediately. Turns out when you grow up on a world where the environment tries to kill you in new and creative ways every day, fighting in a zone where the rules change randomly isn't that big a deal." Rivers paused to duck as something exploded in the background, behind him. "Actually, it's kind of refreshing. Keeps things interesting." The transmission cut to static as another explosion rocked the area around Rivers' position. Holt waited patiently. Human communication equipment was built to survive conditions that would destroy civilian electronics. If Rivers was still alive, he would re-establish contact within minutes. The screen flickered back to life, showing Rivers in a different location, now accompanied by several other human soldiers who were carrying equipment that looked like it had been assembled from broken Void Swarm technology and pieces of their own destroyed gear. "Sorry about that, sir. We had to relocate when the local gravity decided to flow sideways, but we've figured out how to navigate the distortion zones effectively." "How?" "Same way we navigate everything else that doesn't make sense. We adapt until it works." Rivers gestured toward his improvised equipment. The Void Swarm's reality weapon creates localized areas where their own technology stops functioning properly. They can't adapt to it because they never evolved to handle truly chaotic environments, but we did. The strategic implications hit Holt immediately. The Coalition had been fighting the Void Swarm using tactics designed for civilized warfare between rational opponents. They assumed that battlefield conditions should be predictable and controllable. The Swarm's adaptive capabilities worked perfectly against such approaches. But humans had evolved on a world where battlefield conditions changed without warning, and survival required constant adaptation to impossible circumstances. Earth's environment was more hostile and unpredictable than anything the Void Swarm could create artificially. Rivers, Holt said slowly, I'm authorizing implementation of the Deathworld Protocol for all human operations. Sir, if our enemy wants to fight in conditions that defy rational military planning, we'll give them exactly what they're asking for. Holt turned to address his staff. Contact all human units. From now on, we stop trying to coordinate with Coalition forces. We operate independently using full human doctrine. Major Stone looked confused. Sir, what exactly is full human doctrine? Holt smiled grimly. Simple. If something seems impossible, we do it anyway. If the environment is trying to kill us, we use that as a tactical advantage. If the enemy adapts to our weapons, we improvise new ones from whatever's lying around. He paused. And if Coalition forces think our missions are too dangerous, that just means we're finally fighting at the appropriate difficulty level. The next phase of the war began with human forces abandoning all pretense of civilized military operations. They established bases in areas where Coalition scouts couldn't survive long enough to file reports. They developed tactics that assumed equipment failure and massive casualties as normal operational parameters. Most importantly, they began hunting Void Swarm forces in environments where both sides had to improvise solutions to problems that shouldn't exist. The results exceeded all expectations. Void Swarm adaptive capabilities, which had easily countered conventional Coalition tactics, proved useless against opponents who changed their approach not in response to enemy adaptation, but simply because they were bored with their current strategy. When Coalition military analysts tried to study human tactical reports, they discovered documentation that read more like adventure stories than military after-action summaries. Human soldiers described engagements where they used broken enemy weapons as improvised tools, turned environmental hazards into tactical advantages, and achieved victory through methods that violated basic principles of physics. Dr. Tal submitted his final report on human psychology with obvious resignation. The human approach to combat appears to be fundamentally incompatible with rational military doctrine. They treat life-threatening situations as interesting challenges rather than problems to be avoided. They consider equipment failure to be an opportunity for creative problem-solving rather than a mission-ending setback. Most concerning, they derive psychological satisfaction from overcoming obstacles that should logically result in their deaths. The report concluded with a recommendation that was both simple and profound. Human forces should be deployed exclusively in situations too dangerous for any other species to survive. This appears to be their natural environment and optimal operational parameters. Admiral Kess approved the recommendation with relief. The Void Swarm had spent millions of years adapting to fight civilized opponents using predictable tactics and reliable technology. They had never encountered a species that treated chaos as their natural element and impossibility as a personal challenge. For the first time since the war began, the Coalition was winning. The price was accepting that their most effective warriors were fundamentally different from any other known form of intelligent life. The galaxy was being saved by Deathworld Psychopaths, who thought conventional warfare was too easy to be interesting. The core nexus hung in space like a crystalline cathedral the size of a small moon, its faceted surfaces reflecting light that had never touched any natural star. Coalition long-range sensors detected energy readings that defied measurement, gravitational distortions that created local pockets of folded spacetime, and something that their computers could only classify as aggressive mathematics made manifest. Admiral Torres stood in the observation deck of the human flagship Indomitable, watching the Nexus through reinforced windows that shouldn't have been able to contain the radiation leaking from its surface. Around her, 300 human ships moved in formation patterns that would have given Coalition strategists nightmares. There were no backup plans, no evacuation protocols, and no realistic expectation that anyone was coming home. Final casualty projections? Torres asked without taking her eyes off the Nexus. Captain Blake consulted his tactical display with the calm expression of someone reading a shopping list. Coalition analysis estimates 97% casualties minimum for a successful assault. Their computers classify the mission as mathematically equivalent to voluntary extinction. And our analysis? We think their computers are being optimistic, Blake replied cheerfully. But we also think it's going to be the most interesting fight any of us have ever had. Torres nodded. The human fleet was composed entirely of volunteers who understood exactly what they were facing. Every ship's crew had signed deployment papers that were more like suicide notes. Earth's governments had agreed to the mission only after their military leadership explained that refusing would mean watching the void swarm eventually consume every living thing in the galaxy. The choice was simple: die fighting or die waiting. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Gray from the communication station, "we're receiving final transmission clearance from Coalition Command. Admiral Kess sends her personal regards and requests permission to establish memorial monuments for all human personnel. Tell her we appreciate the gesture, but she should wait to see who survives before ordering headstones." Torres turned to address the ship's crew over the internal communication system. "All hands, this is the Admiral. In approximately 1 hour, we're going to assault a structure that exists partially outside normal reality, defended by enemies that can rewrite local physics to suit their tactical needs. Our weapons probably won't work properly. Our ships definitely won't survive intact. And our best-case scenario involves fighting hand-to-hand with creatures made of living crystal and weaponized mathematics." The crew cheered. "Any questions?" Torres asked. Sergeant Murphy raised his hand from the weapons station. "Admiral, what do we do if we actually win?" "We figure out what to do with a galaxy full of aliens who think we're terrifying," Torres replied. "But that's tomorrow's problem." The assault began with human forces doing something that had never been attempted in the history of galactic warfare. They flew their ships directly into the Nexus through openings that existed only when viewed from impossible angles. Coalition doctrine would have called for establishing a perimeter, conducting reconnaissance, and developing detailed tactical plans. Human doctrine called for charging straight at the most dangerous thing they could find and hitting it until it stopped moving. Inside the Nexus, reality operated according to rules that the Void Swarm had written specifically to prevent conventional attacks. Gravity flowed in spirals. Time moved at different speeds in adjacent areas. Energy weapons fired projectiles that arrived before they were shot. The environment itself was designed to drive organic minds insane through sheer impossibility. The humans adapted within minutes. "Torres to all ships," the Admiral broadcast as her vessel navigated through a corridor where up and down changed every few seconds. "Remember, these conditions aren't any worse than a Category 12 storm system. Back home, use your instincts, trust your equipment, and if something doesn't make sense, hit it harder until it does." The battle that followed defied description in any language known to Coalition science. Human forces engaged Void Swarm defenders that existed as living equations and crystallized concepts. They fought in areas where ammunition became pure energy, and energy became solid matter. They used broken pieces of reality itself as improvised weapons against enemies that were more mathematical theorem than physical creature. The turning point came when Sergeant First Class Wells discovered that the Nexus's central core contained the collective intelligence that controlled every Void Swarm unit in the galaxy. The entity existed as a computational matrix larger than most planets, protected by defensive systems that operated through direct manipulation of local reality. "Admiral," Wells reported over a communication channel that somehow functioned despite. "Traveling through folded space, I've found their main brain. It's big, it's ugly, and it's doing things to physics that should be illegal. Can you destroy it?" "Not with anything that resembles conventional explosives," Wells replied. but I've got an idea that's either brilliant or completely insane." "Those are usually the same thing," Torres responded. "Do it." Wells's plan involved using the Nexus's own reality manipulation systems against the central intelligence. By introducing random variables into the computational matrix, specifically by feeding it tactical data from human operations that followed no logical pattern, he could overload the system's ability to process and adapt to new information. The Theta Void Swarm's collective intelligence had evolved to handle any rational threat by analyzing its patterns and developing countermeasures. It had never encountered an opponent whose tactics were based on making decisions that no sane being would make. When Wells began transmitting human combat records directly into the central matrix, the results were immediate and catastrophic. The collective intelligence tried to analyze why humans would deliberately allow themselves to be boarded by enemy forces, why they would establish bases in lethal environments, and why they seemed to enjoy combat scenarios that should have terrified them into paralysis. The computational overload cascaded through every void swarm unit in the galaxy. Across dozens of star systems, crystalline bioships suddenly stopped functioning as their controlling intelligence struggled to process tactical data that violated every principle of rational behavior. "Wells to all units," came the transmission from deep within the Nexus core. "The big brain is having what I can only describe as a mathematical nervous breakdown. I'm going to try something that will either shut it down permanently or make things much worse." "How much worse?" Torres asked. "Well, if this doesn't work, we might accidentally break physics for the entire local galactic cluster." "Approved," Torres replied without hesitation. "If we can't save the galaxy, we might as well make our deaths interesting." Wells initiated the final phase of his improvised plan by introducing the ultimate chaotic variable into the Void Swarm's computational matrix: complete records of human recreational activities. The collective intelligence, already struggling to understand human military tactics, was suddenly forced to process data about humans who voluntarily jumped from aircraft for entertainment, who deliberately exposed themselves to dangerous wild animals for fun, and who considered controlled explosions to be appropriate celebration methods. The system collapse was total and instantaneous. Throughout the galaxy, Void Swarm forces simply stopped functioning as their controlling intelligence, gave up trying to understand a species that treated survival as a casual hobby, rather than a primary imperative. When the Nexus finally imploded, taking the Void Swarm's collective consciousness with it, the surviving human forces found themselves floating in normal space around the debris of what had been the most dangerous structure in known galactic history. The casualty reports were devastating. Of the 300 ships that had entered the Nexus, only 47 emerged intact. Of the 2 million human volunteers who had joined the coalition war effort, fewer than 400,000 survived the entire campaign. Earth mourned its dead while the galaxy celebrated its salvation. The victory celebrations lasted for weeks across coalition space. Every surviving species offered humanity whatever they wanted: advanced technology, entire star systems, positions of authority in galactic government. Humans could write their own terms for whatever they considered appropriate compensation for saving galactic civilization. The human response surprised everyone. "We appreciate the offers," General Beck explained to the assembled Coalition Council. "But we don't really need much. Some medical technology for our wounded would be helpful. Maybe star charts showing where we can find more challenging environments to explore." "More challenging environments?" Admiral Kess asked in confusion. "You've just survived the most dangerous military campaign in galactic history. Surely you would prefer to settle on peaceful worlds with stable climates." Beck looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would we want to do that? We just discovered that the galaxy is full of interesting places and dangerous creatures we've never had a chance to fight. This is the most exciting thing that's happened to humanity since we invented space travel." The Coalition Council exchanged worried glances as they began to understand the implications. They had assumed that humans would be satisfied with victory and eager to integrate peacefully into galactic civilization. Instead, humanity was treating the end of the Void Swarm War as the beginning of their exploration phase. "General Beck," Vel asked carefully, What exactly are humanity's plans for the future? Beck smiled with the expression of someone who had just been asked about their favorite hobby. We want to explore the dangerous parts of the galaxy that everyone else avoids, find out what's living in those radiation zones and toxic nebulae, maybe establish colonies on some of the more challenging death worlds, see if there's anything out there that can give us a better fight than the Void Swarm did. The council chamber fell silent as the full implications sank in. The Coalition had solved their existential crisis by introducing humanity to the wider galaxy. Now they had to deal with the consequences of unleashing a species of Deathworld Psychopaths who considered the recent war to have been excellent recreational activity. As human exploration fleets began heading toward the most dangerous regions of known space, Coalition strategists realized they might have traded one existential threat for another. The Void Swarm had wanted to consume the galaxy. Humanity just wanted to have fun with it. Given what they had learned about human definitions of fun, many Coalition species weren't sure which scenario was more terrifying. But as Admiral Kess watched the human ships disappearing into the galactic rim in search of new challenges, she found herself smiling. The galaxy was definitely going to be more interesting with humans in it. After all, peace had never really been an option for a species that evolved to thrive in hell.